The Arizona sun beat down on the cracked earth, bleaching the world to bone-white and dust-brown. In the unnerving silence between the mesas, 100 mounted warriors' faces, set like stone, crested the ridge. They were a vision of vengeance, poised to wipe the tiny homestead from the map. But they stopped. Below them, a lone figure stood before the humble cabin, a slip of a girl, her eyes milky and blind to the world. She raised a simple wooden flute to her lips, and a melody, haunting and impossibly ancient, drifted on the wind. It was a song of soaring eagles and weeping canyons, a song of their people's soul. And as the last note faded into the vast, unforgiving silence, the impossible happened. The lead warrior, a chief renowned for his unbending pride, slid from his horse. Then another and another, until the entire war party, 100 strong, was kneeling in the dust before the blind settler girl. This is the story of how that single desperate song changed everything. The world for Seraphiel Chamberlain was not one of sight, but of textures, sounds, and scents. She had been without her vision since the scarlet fever of '68 had stolen it, leaving her in a perpetual twilight. Now at 17, she navigated the world with a grace that unnerved the other settlers. She knew the groaning complaint of the porch swing meant a dry wind was coming from the east. She could tell her father's mood by the weight of his footfalls on the cabin's floorboards, heavy and dragging for weary light and clipped for anxiety. Their homestead, which her father Thomas had grimly named Hope's End, was a testament to his stubbornness. It was a small, dusty patch of land carved out of the unforgiving Arizona territory, with a modest cabin and a well that was more temperamental than reliable. It squatted on the edge of lands the Navajo considered sacred, a fact that kept a permanent line etched between Thomas's brows. He was a good man, but a hard one, hollowed out by the loss of his wife Mary on the trail west and hardened by the constant struggle for survival. "Seraphiel," his voice was rough like stones grinding together. "Stay close to the cabin today. I saw tracks by the creek bed this morning. Not animal tracks." Seraphiel's hand stilled from where she was kneading dough. She didn't need to see his face to know the fear coiled in his gut. It smelled of stale sweat and chewing tobacco. "Whose tracks?" she asked softly. "The tribe from the canyon," he grunted. "Black Hawk's people. Just stay close." She nodded, her world shrinking to the familiar sounds of the cabin. Her father didn't hate the native people, not really. He feared them. He feared what he didn't understand, and in this vast, silent land, there was much he didn't understand. Her only true escape was her flute. It had been her mother's, carved from a piece of pale willow wood. When she played, she could paint pictures in her mind, sunsets of fiery orange she could only remember from a younger age, fields of green she could only imagine the face of the mother she desperately tried not to forget. The music was her sight. It was her voice when words failed. That afternoon, the heat was a physical weight. The air was still amplifying every tiny sound. The buzz of a fly, the creak of the cabin's wood frame, the frantic beat of her own heart. A sound, faint and out of place, pricked at the edge of her hearing. It was a low, rhythmic groan carried on the faintest of breezes from the direction of the forbidden creek. It wasn't the sound of an animal in a trap. It was human. Her father's warning echoed in her mind, a clanging bell of caution. But another instinct, one of profound empathy, that the harsh West had not yet scoured from her, took hold. With her hand trailing along the rough-hewn fence line, she moved away from the cabin. The sun was hot on her scalp, and the dry earth was uneven beneath her worn boots. She followed the sound, her ears her guide, leading her down the gentle slope towards the thin trickle of water that was their creek. The groaning grew louder, punctuated by shallow, ragged breaths. She found him lying in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, his body half submerged in the cool mud of the creek bed. The scent of blood, sharp and metallic, hit her first, followed by the smell of sweat and dust. She knelt, her hands hovering in the air before tentatively reaching out. Her fingers brushed against worn leather, then the bare, fever-hot skin of a shoulder. She flinched. He was Navajo. Her father's warnings screamed in her head. But the man's breathing was so labored, his presence so fragile, it extinguished her fear. Her hands explored gently, mapping out his form. He was old. His skin was a road map of wrinkles and scars. She found the source of the blood, a deep, ugly gash in his leg, crudely bound with a strip of cloth. It looked as though he had fallen from the rocks above. His body was rigid with pain. She knew she couldn't move him. She knew calling her father would be a disaster. Thomas would see a threat, not a dying man. So she did the only thing she could think of to offer comfort. Sitting back on her heels, she pulled the willow flute from the pocket of her apron. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised it to her lips. She didn't play a familiar tune, a reel or a hymn from back east. Instead, she let the man's pain guide her fingers. She played a slow, somber melody, a lament for the suffering she felt emanating from him. The notes were low and mournful, like the cry of a lone dove at dusk. The man's rigid posture softened. The groaning subsided, replaced by a long, shuddering sigh. He was listening. She poured all the compassion she felt into the music, letting the flute speak the words of comfort she could not. For a long while, the only sounds by the creek were the man's shallow breathing and the haunting song of the blind girl's flute. She played for a dying stranger, unaware that this single act of kindness was a stone dropped into a silent pond, its ripples destined to become a tidal wave. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in colors Seraphil could feel as a change in the air's warmth against her skin. The old man's breathing had become a fragile rhythm beneath her melody. He was no longer groaning, but a faint guttural sound rumbled in his chest with each exhale. It wasn't a sound of pain, but something else entirely. It was a murmur, a broken cadence. Seraphil lowered her flute, tilting her head. She focused, filtering out the gurgle of the creek and the rustle of leaves. The sound was a hum, a deep, raspy whisper of a tune. It was fragmented, broken by gasps for air, but it was unmistakably a melody. It was profoundly sad, yet beautiful, echoing the vastness of the land around them. It spoke of loss and endurance, of ancient things she could not comprehend. Her musician's ear latched onto the pattern. It was a strange scale, unlike any folk song or church hymn she knew. She raised her flute again, and this time she tried to echo him. She played back a short phrase she had deciphered from his humming. A tremor went through the man's body. His hand, heavy and calloused, lifted from the mud and gripped her arm. The strength in his grasp was surprising, desperate. He hummed again, more insistently, now correcting her tune with a slight change of a single note. It was a small shift, but it changed the entire feel of the melody, turning it from a lament into something more. A prayer, perhaps. For the better part of an hour they communicated in this way. The dying elder, whom she would later know as Stone Hand, hummed the fragments of his song, his last testament, and the blind settler girl with her perfect ear wove them together on her willow flute. She didn't understand what she was playing. She didn't know its name or its meaning. To her it was simply his song, a final gift she was helping him piece together before he passed from the world. The melody settled deep within her, carving itself into her memory, as if it had always belonged there. The spell was broken by the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. "Seraphiel!" Her father's voice was a whip crack in the tranquil air. Terror shot through her. She scrambled to her feet, the flute clutched in her hand. The old man's hand fell from her arm with a weak splash. "Get away from him! Now!" Thomas's voice was ragged with panic. She heard him storming down the bank, his footsteps churning the mud. "Father, he's hurt. He fell. He's one of them." Thomas snarled his fear, making him cruel. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip bruising, and physically hauled her away from the creek bed. "Have you lost your mind? They'll kill us for this. They'll think we did it. No, I was helping him. He was—" She struggled for the words. "He was singing." "Singing, girl, you're delirious from the sun," he said, dragging her back up the slope towards the cabin. He didn't look back at the man dying in the mud. He couldn't afford to see a person. All he saw was a threat, a harbinger of the violence he had spent years trying to outrun. He thrust her inside the cabin, the door slamming shut with a sound of finality. "You will not leave this house again. Do you understand me? You don't know what you've done." That night, Seraphiel lay on her cot, the melody swirling in her head. It wouldn't leave her. It was a phantom limb, a piece of the old man's spirit that had latched onto hers. She could hear her father pacing the floor, the scrape of his chair, the clink of a whiskey bottle against a cup. His fear was a suffocating blanket in the small cabin. She felt a profound and terrible guilt. She had left the man alone. Her father was right in one sense. She didn't know what she had done. She had shared a final sacred moment with a stranger and then abandoned him. The beautiful haunting song he had given her now felt like a brand, a mark of her failure. Just before dawn, a new sound pierced the silence. It was a cry, but not of an animal. It was a human voice raised in a long, ululating wail of pure grief that seemed to tear at the fabric of the sky. It was joined by another, and then another, rising from the direction of the canyon. Seraphiel sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. The old man was dead, and his people had found him. Her father's footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the cries of mourning. Hope's End felt less like a homestead and more like a tomb waiting for the world to close in. The song in her head played on no longer a prayer, but a funeral dirge. The morning sun did little to burn away the chill of the previous night's discovery. Kyle, son of Chief Black Hawk, knelt beside the body of Stone Hand. The air was thick with the sorrow of his people, a silent, heavy grief that was more profound than the ritual wails that had announced the death. Kyle's father stood over him, a granite statue of fury, his face a mask of controlled rage. Stone Hand was more than an elder. He was their keeper of songs, the living library of their tribe's history, laws, and spirituality. His voice, now silenced forever, had been the thread that connected them to their ancestors. His loss was incalculable, a fire that had consumed countless irreplaceable scrolls. The settlers. Black Hawk's voice was low, dangerous. His leg is broken, but this was not the work of a fall alone. He was left in the mud to die like an animal. Their homestead stands on our land, drinks our water, and now it takes our wisdom. Kyle examined the ground, his gaze missing nothing. He was his father's son in pride and strength, but he possessed a thoughtfulness that Black Hawk sometimes mistook for weakness. He saw the signs of the fall on the rocks above the displaced stones, the scraped earth. But he also saw something else. Small, strange footprints in the mud near the body, far too small and light for a man. and beside Stone Hand's outstretched hand, nestled in the reeds, was a small object. He picked it up. It was a bird, crudely but lovingly carved from a piece of pale willow wood, the kind that didn't grow this close to the canyon. It was smooth to the touch, clearly worn by anxious hands. It was a child's trinket. A girl. It made no sense. This wasn't the sign of a brutal attack. It was a sign of presence. "Father," Kyle said, holding up the carving. "Look at this." Black Hawk glanced at it, his lip curling in dismissal. "A toy. A taunt. They mock us, even in death." "Who would mock us with a child's carving?" Kyle pressed. "This feels wrong. It does not speak of violence. It speaks of trespassers." Black Hawk countered his voice like rolling thunder. "Their very presence here is violence. Stone Hand would not have come this far down the creek unless he was drawn here or driven. We will have justice. The spirits of the ancestors cry out for it." He turned and strode back towards the waiting warriors, his grief solidifying into a hard, sharp-edged purpose. Kyle looked from the small bird in his palm to the settler's cabin, a tiny, vulnerable box squatting under the vast, indifferent sky. A knot of uncertainty tightened in his stomach. His father's path was simple blood for blood. But the small wooden bird told a different, more complicated story. Meanwhile, a different kind of predator was watching the situation unfold. Silas Croft was a man whose soul was as barren as the lands he coveted. He was a cattle baron who believed in the simple manifest destiny of his own greed. The Navajo tribe was a nuisance, occupying prime grazing land. The Chamberlain homestead was a stubborn thorn, refusing to sell him their water rights to the creek. The death of the elder was not a tragedy to him. It was a God-sent opportunity. He rode to his foreman, a lean, cruel man named Jebediah, whose face was a collection of sharp angles and mean intentions. "You hear that caterwauling this morning, Jeb?" Croft said, a thin smile on his lips. "Sounds like our neighbors lost one of their own." Jebediah spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Right on Chamberlain's doorstep, boss. Convenient." "More than convenient. It's leverage," Croft said, his eyes gleaming. "Black Hawk will be seeing red. He'll be looking for someone to blame, and Old Man Chamberlain is the closest target. A little push is all it will take." "What kind of push?" "Fear is the best motivator. We'll make Chamberlain believe he needs our protection. We'll make Black Hawk believe Chamberlain is his sworn enemy." Croft laid out his plan. "Tonight you and the boys will pay a visit to the creek. Not the homestead, mind you. The creek. Upstream. A few well-placed rocks, a bit of mud. Make that trickle of theirs run even thinner. Then spook some of Chamberlain's few cattle. Make it look like a raid. He'll come running to us for help, and Black Hawk will see it as an admission of guilt." Jebediah grinned, a humorless stretching of his lips. "And when they wipe each other out, we just move in and take what's left." "Precisely," Croft said, turning his horse. "Let the savages and the squatters bleed each other dry. We'll be the only ones left to inherit the dirt." As the sun set, casting long, ominous shadows from the mesas, two distinct plans were set in motion. One was born of grief and a thirst for justice. The other was born of cold, calculating greed. Trapped squarely between them was Hope's End, and a blind girl haunted by a song she didn't understand, holding a clue she didn't even know she had lost. The whispers on the wind were no longer of mourning, but of war. The tension around Hope's End was a palpable thing. Seraphil could feel it in the air, a static charge that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Her father hadn't spoken more than a few clipped sentences to her since he'd dragged her from the creek. He spent his days cleaning his rifle, his movements stiff and deliberate, and his nights staring out the window into the oppressive darkness, a sentinel guarding a doomed fortress. The well began to run dry 2 days after Stonehand's body was found. The trickle of water they hauled in buckets became a muddy sludge, then nothing. "It's them," Thomas seethed, slamming the empty bucket down. "They've dammed the creek. They're trying to choke us out." "Father, you don't know that," Seraphiel pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. She sat at the table, her hands tracing the worn grain of the wood. The little wooden bird Cale had found was one of her carvings. She whittled them to keep her hands busy, to give shape to the images in her mind. She hadn't even realized she'd dropped it. "Don't I?" He shot back, his voice raw with fear. "First, their elder dies on our land, and now our water is gone. This is how it starts, Seraphiel. A slow strangulation before the final blow." That night, the rest of their world fell apart. The sound of their 3 scrawny cows bellowing in terror ripped through the night, followed by the splintering crash of their corral fence. Thomas burst from the cabin rifle in hand, firing a wild shot into the darkness. By the time he returned, panting and smelling of gunpowder, it was over. The cattle were gone, driven off into the night. "They're savages," he roared, slamming his fist on the table, making Seraphiel jump. "They want it all. They want us dead." Seraphiel could hear the utter despair in his voice. He was a man pushed to the very edge of his endurance. His hope, the very reason he'd named this forsaken place, had finally been extinguished. The next morning, as if summoned by their desperation, Silas Croft and Jebediah rode up to the cabin. Seraphiel listened from her chair as her father met them on the porch. Croft's voice was smooth, like oil poured on troubled water. "Thomas, my friend, I heard the commotion last night," Croft said with feigned concern. "Looks like you've had some trouble." "They're destroying me, Silas." Thomas's voice was broken. "My water, my cattle. I'm ruined." "It's Black Hawk's doing," Croft said, his tone full of certainty. "He's a proud, vengeful man. He sees what happened to his elder as an insult, and he aims to wipe you from this valley. But you don't have to face him alone." Seraphiel's blood ran cold. She could sense the trap in the man's oily words, the hidden hook in the bait. "What are you proposing?" Thomas asked, his voice a sliver of its usual strength. "An alliance," Croft declared. "My men and I are well armed. Together we can teach that tribe a lesson about respecting property and Christian folk. We can push them back into their canyon for good. All I ask in return is that you reconsider my offer for your water rights. In fact, sign them over to me now as a show of good faith, and my men will be your personal guard." It was a devil's bargain, and Seraphiel knew it. Croft didn't care about them. He cared about the water and the land. He was using their fear to steal what he couldn't buy. "Father, no," Seraphiel said, standing up, her voice trembling but clear. "Don't do it. There's something wrong here." "Stay out of this, Seraphiel." Thomas snapped his back to her. He was a drowning man, and Croft was offering him a lifeline, no matter how rotten it was. "You don't understand the world of men." Meanwhile, in the Navajo camp, the mood was equally grim. The warriors were painting their faces, their movements sharp and angry. The death of Stonehand, followed by the gunshot from the settler's cabin in the night, had been interpreted as the final acts of aggression. Kyle stood before his father, holding the small wooden bird. "Father, we must be certain. Firing a gun in the dark is the act of a scared farmer, not a confident enemy. And this carving, it still does not feel like an object of hate. You see weakness where I see provocation," Black Hawk said, his voice hard. "The farmer has allied himself with the cattle baron Croft. Our scouts saw them meeting this morning. They are one and the same now. They gather their strength to strike. We will strike first. We ride at dawn." Kyle looked at the faces of the other warriors. He saw their grief, their anger, their unquestioning loyalty to his father. His own heart was heavy with doubt, a single dissenting voice in a chorus of war. He believed his father was wrong. He believed they were being led into a conflict that was built on a misunderstanding, a lie. But his words were like stones thrown against a cliff face. They made no impact. The shadow of the hawk was stretching long across the valley, ready to fall upon the small, isolated cabin. Both sides were now convinced of the other's treachery, their paths set on a collision course by a master manipulator who stood to gain everything from their mutual destruction. As dusk settled, Seraphiel could hear the distant rhythmic sound of a drum beating from the direction of the canyon. It was a heartbeat, steady and ominous, counting down the hours until the bloodshed began. The drumbeat was a pulse of impending doom that resonated in Seraphiel's very bones. It had been throbbing from the canyon since sunset, a steady, relentless rhythm that promised a dawn of violence. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the silence of two people who had nothing left to say. Her father sat with his rifle across his lap, his face illuminated by the flickering lamplight, a portrait of grim resignation. He had made his deal with Croft. Jebediah and two other rough-looking men were now camped by their well, a supposed guard that felt more like an occupation. Seraphiel knew with a certainty that defied logic that this was all wrong. The man at the creek stone hand hadn't been a monster. The melody he had shared with her was not one of hatred. It was one of profound sorrow and history. The men outside with their coarse laughter and the sharp scent of cheap whiskey were the true threat. They smelled of greed, not grief. A desperate idea born of terror and a sliver of hope began to form in her mind. It was madness. It was suicide, but it was the only thing she had left. The song, the silent song he had given her. It was the only truth in this web of lies. She had to make them listen. While her father stared blankly into the fire, lost in his own dark thoughts, Seraphiel moved silently. She slipped her worn shawl over her shoulders and took her mother's willow flute from its place on the mantel. Her fingers, cold with fear, wrapped around the familiar, smooth wood. It was her only shield, her only weapon. She eased the cabin door open, the creak of the hinges sounding as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Thomas didn't stir. She slipped out into the cool night, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. She could hear the low murmur of Jebediah and his men, but they were on the other side of the cabin, their attention focused on their bottle. Guided by the sound of the distant drum and the memory of the land's contours, Seraphiel walked away from the flickering lights of her home. She walked out into the vast open plain that separated the homestead from the mesas. The night was not black to her, but a tapestry of sounds and feelings. The chirping of crickets, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush, the solid feel of the earth beneath her feet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every rustle of a bush, every cry of a distant coyote sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a blind girl, walking willingly into a war zone. But the song in her head was stronger than her fear. It was a current pulling her forward. She walked until the sounds of the homestead faded behind her, and the drumbeat grew louder, a living thing in the darkness. She stopped in what she judged to be the middle of the open ground, a place where she was utterly exposed, a lone figure in an immense, dark arena. This was it. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the dry night air filling her lungs. She raised the flute to her lips. Her fingers found their places, the notes etched not just in her memory, but in her soul. And she played. She didn't play loudly at first. The melody began as a whisper, a tentative question posed to the silent, watchful night. It was the song Stone Hand had hummed the melody of his last breaths. She poured every ounce of her feelings into it, her fear, her guilt over leaving him, her desperate plea for understanding. The music flowed out of her, a ribbon of pure, haunting sound in the darkness. It was a song that didn't belong in this place of impending violence. It spoke of ancient skies, of seasons, turning of a people's long journey through time. It was a song of memory, a song of spirit. As she played, her fear began to recede, replaced by a strange sense of purpose. She was no longer just Seraphiel Chamberlain, the blind settler girl. She was a vessel. She was giving Stone Hand his voice back. She played with her eyes closed, though it made no difference. In her mind, the music painted the pictures she could not see. She imagined the warriors in the canyon hearing it, their hands stilling as they prepared their weapons. She imagined Kyle, the man she'd never met, but who had lost his elder, hearing the notes and feeling the truth within them. She imagined Chief Black Hawk, his heart hardened by grief, hearing a song he thought was lost to the world forever. She played for her father, hoping the music would cut through his fear and remind him of the man he was before the West had broken him. She played for the memory of her mother, who had taught her that beauty could exist even in the harshest of places. The lone, fragile melody rose into the vast star-dusted sky, a single thread of peace thrown across a chasm of hatred. It was a desperate gamble, an act of insane courage. And as the final mournful note hung in the air, a new sound came from the east, the thunder of 100 hoofbeats, moving not with the chaos of a charge, but with the speed of a great, urgent purpose. They were coming. The thunder of hoofbeats grew from a distant rumble to a ground-shaking roar. From the cabin, Thomas heard it, and his blood turned to ice. He looked up and saw Seraphiel's empty cot, the open door. A primal scream of Seraphiel was ripped from his throat as he grabbed his rifle and burst out onto the porch. Jebediah and his men scrambled to their feet, fumbling for their own weapons, their whiskey-fueled bravado evaporating into sheer panic. "It's an attack! They're coming!" Jebediah yelled, his voice cracking. But Seraphiel, standing alone in the darkness, didn't flinch. She simply lowered her flute and waited, a fragile beacon in the path of an oncoming storm. Just as the sun's first rays broke over the eastern mesas, casting the landscape in a spectral grey light, the war party crested the ridge. 100 mounted warriors, their faces painted for battle, their lances and rifles held at the ready. They were a vision of righteous fury, the fulfillment of Thomas's deepest fears. Leading them was Chief Black Hawk, his expression as unyielding as the rock of the canyon he called home. Beside him rode Cale, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. They saw her then, a single small figure standing in their path, and they heard it. The echo of the melody still hung in the air, a ghost of a sound that had stopped them in their tracks. The war party slowed their charge, breaking into a confused trot and then a complete halt. 100 horses stamped and snorted the jingle of harnesses, the only sound in the sudden heavy silence. The warriors stared not at the cabin, not at the armed men on the porch, but at the blind girl. Kyle was the first to understand. His mind flashed back to his final conversations with Stone Hand. The old keeper of songs had been lamenting that his voice was too weak to teach Kyle the most sacred of their melodies, the song of renewal. It was a song not heard in generations, a piece of music so powerful it was only to be played when the tribe had lost its way to remind them of who they were. Stone Hand had described it as the sound of the wind weeping in the high canyons at first light. The melody the girl had played was not just similar, it was perfect. It was a song. He looked at his father. Black Hawk's stony expression had shattered. His eyes were wide, fixed on Seraphil. His lips moved, but no sound came out. This was a song only a keeper of songs could know. It was their history, their covenant with the Creator, woven into a melody. To hear it now played on a simple settler's flute by a blind girl was not just impossible. It was a profound, spiritual event. It was a sign. Stone Hand hadn't been murdered. He hadn't died in hatred. In his final moments he had found a worthy vessel. He had passed on their most sacred legacy to the one person who had the ears to hear and the heart to understand its soul without knowing its words. He had ensured the song would not die with him. A deep, shuddering breath escaped Black Hawk's chest. The rage that had fueled him, the grief that had hardened his heart, washed away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming reverence. This was not a battleground, it was sacred ground. Slowly, with the gravitas of a man performing a holy rite, Chief Black Hawk swung his leg over his horse and slid to the ground. He stood for a moment, his eyes never leaving Seraphil, before he dropped to one knee, bowing his head. A collective gasp went through his warriors. They looked from their kneeling chief to the girl, and understanding dawned on their faces as well. This was not a surrender. It was an act of profound respect, not for the girl herself, but for the spirit that had chosen to speak through her. It was a tribute to the memory of Stone Hand and the miracle of his song's survival. Kyle dismounted, his heart swelling with a feeling he couldn't name. He knelt beside his father, and then, like a wave, the action rippled through the war party. One by one the warriors dismounted. Lances rested on the ground, rifles were lowered. 100 men who, moments before, had been ready to kill and die, knelt in the dust of the Arizona dawn. On the porch of the cabin, Thomas Chamberlain watched his rifle slipping from his numb fingers. His mind could not process what his eyes were seeing. The terrifying savages he had feared, the monsters of his nightmares, were kneeling. They were kneeling before his daughter. Jebediah and Croft's men were equally stunned, their mouths hanging open. This was not in their plan. The neat, bloody conflict they had engineered had just dissolved into a scene of baffling reverence. Their power, built on fear and misunderstanding, had been broken by a song. Seraphil couldn't see the scene, but she could feel the change. The aggressive energy of the charging horses had vanished. The air, once vibrating with hatred, was now still and thick with an emotion she couldn't identify. She could hear the soft thud of bodies meeting the earth, the rustle of 100 men going to their knees. She clutched her flute, her knuckles white tears she didn't understand, streaming from her sightless eyes. The song had been heard. The sun climbed higher, baking the kneeling warriors and the stunned onlookers in its unforgiving light. The silence stretched, profound, and absolute. It was Cale who finally broke it. He rose slowly and walked forward, his footsteps the only sound in the world. He stopped a few feet from Seraphil, his eyes taking in her pale, tear-streaked face and the simple willow flute clutched in her hand. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice quiet, devoid of the aggression she had expected. It was deep and steady. Seraphil flinched at the sound of his voice, so close. "An old man," she whispered, her own voice, trembling. "He was hurt by the creek. He couldn't speak. He hummed it. I just played what I heard." Kyle looked back at his father, who had now risen to his feet. "Father, she speaks the truth. It was Stone Hand. He gave her the song." Black Hawk walked forward to join his son, his gaze piercing. He looked from Seraphil to Thomas, who was now hesitantly making his way down from the porch. The chief's eyes fell on Jebediah, and the other two men who were trying to shrink into the shadows of the cabin, their plot unraveling before their eyes. The song she played is the song of renewal. Black Hawk said, his voice resonating with authority. He was not speaking to Seraphiel, but to everyone. It is a song of our soul. It is only known to the keeper. Our elder didn't die of a settler's hatred. He spent his last breath ensuring our soul would not die with him. He gave it to her. His gaze settled on Seraphiel with an intensity that she could feel like a physical heat. An innocent heart and a true ear. The spirits chose well. Thomas finally reached his daughter's side, placing a protective, trembling hand on her shoulder. He looked at the formidable chief, not with fear anymore, but with a dawning, shame-faced understanding. I found her with him, Thomas stammered. I was afraid. I pulled her away. I left him. A flicker of the old anger returned to Black Hawk's eyes, but it was tempered by the morning's miracle. Your fear almost cost us all a great deal, he said gravely. Fear is a poison. It has been poured into the wells of both our peoples. His gaze shifted pointedly towards Jebediah. At that moment, Silas Croft, who had been watching the scene unfold from a nearby ridge, realized his plan was in ruins. This was supposed to be a massacre, not a powwow. In a fit of rage, he spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving his men to their fate. Jebediah saw his boss flee, and his own panic took over. It was Croft, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger after his departing employer. He damned the creek. He paid us to drive off your cattle. He wanted you to kill each other so he could have the land. The confession hung in the air, ugly and stark. The missing pieces clicked into place for both Thomas and Black Hawk. They had been puppets, their strings pulled by a greedy man who preyed on their worst instincts. They had been aimed at each other like loaded guns, and only the song from a blind girl's flute had prevented them from firing. Black Hawk's expression hardened. The poison has a name. Thomas looked at the proud chief, at the 100 warriors who were now standing, their faces full of a new unified purpose. He looked at his daughter, who had faced down a war party with nothing but a melody. The shame inside him was a burning coal. He had been so wrong, so blinded by his own fear. Chief, Thomas said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I have done you a great mistake. My fear and my grief made me a fool. But this man, Croft, is an enemy to us all. He stole my cattle, but he wants your land. My homestead is small and my well is dry. But what I have, my rifle and my resolve, is yours to command if you will have it. It was an unprecedented offer, a settler pledging allegiance to a Navajo chief. Black Hawk studied Thomas for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. We do not need your rifle as much as we need your honesty. Today the fighting is done. But a new fight begins, not against each other but together. He turned to Cale. Take some men. Find the dam on the creek. Let the water flow again. Then he looked at Seraphiel, a hint of softness entering his stern eyes. Your flute speaks a language truer than any words. You will be safe. You have the protection of my entire nation. As Kyle led a group of warriors towards the creek, he paused beside Seraphiel. The bird you carved, he said softly, pulling the small wooden object from his pouch and placing it in her hand. It told me your spirit was not one of malice. I am Cale. Seraphiel's fingers closed around the familiar shape of her carving. I am Seraphiel. For the first time, a true alliance was forged in the valley, not by treaty or by force, but by the shared experience of a miracle. The settlers and the Navajo, once on the brink of mutual destruction, were now united against a common enemy. And at the center of it all stood a blind girl and a warrior's son, their hands having just brushed, for the first time, the first tentative notes of a new, far more personal song beginning to play between them, a melody of hope rising from the ashes of a nearly started war. The sun, now fully risen, began its relentless work of heating the valley floor. The air, which had crackled with the energy of imminent battle, was now filled with a strange and watchful calm. The Navajo warriors remained standing in silent, disciplined groups, their initial reverence giving way to a quiet curiosity. They were guardians now, not aggressors, their presence a protective cordon around the humble cabin. The first sign of the new reality came as a sound Seraphiel had almost forgotten, the strong, steady gurgle of water. Kyle and his men had returned from the creek, their task complete. The sound of the well bucket being lowered and coming up heavy, splashing over the sides, was the sweetest music Thomas Chamberlain had heard in years. He drank deeply from the ladle. Kyle offered him the cool water, a baptism washing away the dust and bitterness of his fear. It was a simple act, a warrior giving a settler water, but in the context of the morning, it was a profound treaty. Black Hawk watched the exchange, his arms crossed over his powerful chest. He then turned his gaze to Thomas's porch, as if measuring it. "We must speak," he said, his voice a command that allowed no refusal. Not with 100 warriors listening, but as two fathers. Thomas, his face etched with a humility he had never known, simply nodded and led the way. The cabin porch became the site of the most unlikely council the territory had ever seen. Black Hawk sat on the worn bench where Thomas usually cleaned his tools, his presence seeming to fill the entire space. Thomas took the rickety chair opposite him. Kyle stood by the porch rail, a bridge between them, while Seraphiel sat near the doorway, her hands resting in her lap, the flute lying beside her. She was the reason they were talking instead of bleeding, and her quiet presence was a constant reminder of the stakes. "My son tells me your fear was stoked by the cattle baron Croft," Black Hawk began, his voice level. "But the fear was there long before. I have seen it in the eyes of all your people." Thomas looked at his calloused hands. "When you have lost everything once," he said, his voice thick with the memory of his wife's grave, "you live in terror of losing what little you have left. Croft did not light the fire, I admit. He only poured oil upon it. I am ashamed. My ears were deafened by my own fear. Fear is a cage we build for ourselves." Black Hawk responded, his words carrying the weight of wisdom. "Croft gave you the bars, but you were the one who locked the door. I too was in a cage. My grief for Stonehand blinded me. I was ready to answer a lie with blood. Your daughter with her song didn't give you bars or keys. She simply reminded us that the sky above is the same for all, and there is no cage. The honesty was brutal but clean. It cleared the air of pretense. Croft will not stop." Kyle interjected, his voice sharp and focused. "He fled because his plan failed, but a snake does not abandon its nest. He will go to the fort at San Defiance. He will tell the soldiers that a band of savage Navajo have taken a settler hostage. He will twist this morning's truth into a new and more dangerous lie, and this time he will return with blue-coated soldiers who shoot first and ask questions never." A new cold dread settled over Thomas. Kyle was right. Croft would use the law of the white man, a law that had little love for the Navajo, to finish what he started. "What can we do?" Thomas asked, looking from Black Hawk to Kale. For the first time, he was asking for help, admitting he was powerless. "We do not wait for the snake to strike," Black Hawk said. "We must move its nest. Kyle, you will ride. You will take 5 of our best men and the settler's son-in-law." He paused, looking at Thomas. "He has no son." "No," Thomas said. Then he looked at Seraphiel, a new light of understanding in his eyes. He doesn't need my son. He needs my daughter. The suggestion hung in the air. Black Hawk and Kale both turned to look at Seraphiel. Her Black Hawk questioned, his brow furrowed. She is a blind girl. She is the truth, Thomas stated simply. No soldier will believe me over a rich man like Croft, and they will not believe you forgive me over a white man. But Seraphiel, her song is the proof. If she can play for the fort commander as she played for you, if she can tell him the story, she can do what none of our guns or our anger can. She can stop the war before it begins. The audacity of the plan was staggering. To send a blind girl on a dangerous ride to a military fort to face down a powerful liar and skeptical soldiers. Kyle looked at Seraphiel, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and awe. He saw not her blindness, but the immense strength she had already shown. She would not be alone. Kyle said, his voice unwavering. I would ride with her. I would protect her with my life. Black Hawk was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on Seraphiel. He saw the wisdom in Thomas's desperate plan. She was their only weapon that Croft could not counter. It is a great burden to place on one so young, the chief said softly. Seraphiel, who had listened to the entire exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. The song was a gift, she said. It does not feel right to keep it only for myself. If playing it again will keep our homes safe, then I will go. Her decision settled the matter. An uneasy alliance had been forged in the dawn, and now in the full light of day, it had a purpose. It was a desperate, fragile plan, hinging on the courage of a girl who saw the world, not with her eyes, but with her heart, and the warrior who had been the first to truly hear her song. The story of Seraphiel and Kale is a powerful reminder that even in the harshest of times, in the deepest divides, fueled by fear and misunderstanding, courage can manifest in the most unexpected ways. It wasn't a gun or a treaty that brought peace to the valley. It was a song from a place of pure empathy. It shows that listening, truly listening, can be more powerful than fighting, and that the bravest acts often come from the quietest souls. The melody that saved them echoes a timeless truth. Our shared humanity can bridge any chasm, if only we have the courage to play its song. If this story of incredible bravery, unexpected connection, and the transcendent power of music moved you, please take a moment to click the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of the Old West and the strength of the human spirit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life. Let us know in the comments what part of Seraphiel's journey resonated with you the most. Thank you for listening.